Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to TFR Newsroom. Apache Cassandra community has announced the release of Cassandra 4.0, which focuses specifically on stability and performance, among other things. But what are all those things and what kind of performance and stability we are talking about? To discuss all these topics, today we have with us two guests, Patrick McFadin, VP of Developer Relations at DataStax, and Ben Bromhead, CTO and co-founder at Instaclustr. Ben, Patrick, it's great to have you both on the show again.
No, thanks for having us again.
Yeah, awesome. Great to be here.
Yeah, and this is an exciting, most awaited. These, the major releases are always exciting. So from your perspective, I want to hear, before we talk about the release and everything else, I just want to hear from both of you because you are there. What are the use cases where Cassandra, sets kind of still apart from other databases where it makes more sense?
Wow, we're going to have to bounce back and forth, Ben. Well, I'll start out with a more general use. It is a general purpose database. It's meant to be a transactional database closer to your users. So if we think about the workloads that Cassandra was designed around, which is running websites, mobile applications, those use cases are still the most prevalent. And so the biggest users in the world are using Cassandra for those workloads closer to their customer. Apple, Netflix. I mean, when you use a mobile app on your phone, you're probably using Cassandra at one point, so there's just plenty of use cases to point out. I'll let Ben get specific if he can.
Thanks, Patrick. But yeah, I mean, really great point here. I think in the past, Cassandra kind of fit into some really nice, very well-defined, use cases. Definitely ticked a lot of boxes when it came to, IoT, right? Anything that had like a huge kind of write volume compared to the read volume. But over the period of time, we've seen it mature into, like, as Patrick said, a really awesome general purpose database, right? And, you see as people reach the limits of scalability or the limits of availability when it comes to some of the other databases out there, we see developers reaching for the tool in the toolbox that is Apache Cassandra, right? And so you've seen it kind of blossom from, that IoT use case to, serving general production traffic, doing customer 360, doing fraud detection. These are just some of the more interesting use cases. Think of the most boring use case you can. E-commerce, managing some sort of checkout function, right, from a shopping cart. The standard example that we build as developers, and Cassandra is powering that, right, all the way through to more interesting stuff.
Right, and when we are talking about some of these, you can call it boring if you want, but most demanding use cases, especially scalability, especially when we look at this. We live in a cloud native world where the kind of skill we are talking about was not even imagined, 4 or 5 or 10 years ago. So can you also kind of talk about the kind of role and importance of Cassandra in this modern cloud native world? And everybody is on cloud, right? And we are talking about use cases, as you mentioned. It could be either edge IoT use case, or it could be, very, very, mission critical use case. So just talk about the significance of, because we are talking a lot about Cassandra these days. Why is that happening? Why is it so important today?
Well, yes, you mentioned that, like, you shouldn't call it boring, but actually that's the best feature of a database is when it's boring. You do not want an exciting database. And if anything, 4.0 has made it even more boring in the best way, which is when you're trying to scale out, build your business, create new use cases faster than your competitor, you don't need a database to get in your way, because that is the most critical part of that entire stack. And we know that everyone that's in the community is deploying Cassandra as well as developing on it. And so when we talk about cloud workloads, on-prem, yes, check the box. But stability, quality, correctness of data, it doesn't lose data. Those are just really baseline things that are hard for any database, really. But when Cassandra 4 ships, that was the first line item on the sheet. This is the most important feature.
What are the new features, functionalities that are there? And as we're talking initially, stability and performance is there. What are the other things that you're like, hey, this is with 4.0 and this is what it is all about?
Well, I think Patrick pointed out, the number one feature, which is stability and just being boring, right? So I won't cover that too much, but that's really been enabled by a huge focus on, testing and correctness within the community. So there's just been a ton of technical work that has gone into being able to prove that out, to test it, to get that being reproducible. But in terms of more actual exciting features and capabilities that people will be able to get their hands on the performance side of things, internally we've seen a bit more of a broader adoption of the Netty networking framework, which is a great high performance networking library within the Java ecosystem. There's been some structural changes based around that that have enabled a number of really cool things. And one of those is zero copy streaming, right? Which is essentially allows an Apache Cassandra node to stream the data that it's responsible for those underlying files on disk without actually having to, copy that into the JVM, without have to do anything when it comes to, kind of kernel land. It just throws that on the wire. And we've now got wire level streaming speeds between those nodes, right? So in practice, what that means is I can replace a node in my cluster way quicker, right? Practically, that means I can now run denser nodes. I can now get back up and running in the case of a failure in a much quicker kind of sense. So that's just generally improving everybody's life. There's some awesome features around, auditing and traceability that'll be great for enterprise users. But I think, they're kind of the key ones that I would kind of tick the box on. But there's a ton more out there. Like, I invite everyone to go have a look at, the Apache Cassandra blog, go check the changes.txt file. There's going to be a little bit of everything for everybody in there.
If you just look at performance and stability, these are things which are more or less like objective and subjective, because performance, how do you actually gauge it? Or stability, because it depends on different use case. So did you kind of do any activities, any testing whatsoever to actually gauge whether it's really, if you're making a claim that, performance enhancement and stability, how do you say that it is the most stable or most efficient one?
There's only one way to do it, and that's to test it against those variety of workloads. And that was one of the things that the project, the everyone who's contributing to the project, this was something that we all agreed to, that we would start putting it into production as soon as we could, and before we released it. And so the largest operators, and actually this happened just before the release, Apple found a problem, and we had voted for it to be released. And like an hour after the vote was finished, an Apple engineer says, I found a bug, and we stopped it and rewound it, because that was our commitment. But that was found in a production environment. So largest deployments, smallest deployments, this is the only way you can get any kind of confidence in software, is just push it. And it's been in production running for a long time and a lot of workloads. There are other tools that simulate that, but you just can't beat real production, as everyone knows.
Why did you stop it? Did Apple say that, hey, your iPhones will stop working after that if you did release it with the... No, that's a joke. From you gave one example, and of course these kind of things do come up. Was there anything else that especially from the performance point of view and the testing, which either the results were like kind of you're overwhelming, or you're like, oh wow, we were not expecting that kind of results from this release?
It's funny you mentioned that. I think the first time that some of the changes to the networking stack landed, people were really excited because, in theory, they knew that those changes should have a big impact on performance. Then of course, when everyone saw the preview build or built it and tested it themselves in their own, environments, they're like, oh, hang on, guys, what's going on? We're seeing a performance regression. What's happening? We've put all this work into it. But then, of course, because it's an absolutely awesome community, people work together. They dug into it. I believe now, I'm not going to try and guess what it was. I remember reading the thread, but there was some sort of primitive that we're using. I'm going to completely get this wrong, but I'm going to say it was a skip list versus a linked list versus a hash map that we were using in the wrong place, right? And that was just tanking performance. A bunch of work happened. We saw a few other bits and pieces. Community really kind of pulled together on that particular patch. And got that all sorted and are like, oh, hey, now we're seeing kind of the performance that we expected, right? And of course, this is something that happens pretty normally, in a lot of performance improvements, is that you fix one area and then the bottleneck shifts, right? And the community gave a great space to allow the developers and the contributors to experiment and to test, and to kind of work that out without having too much pressure. So I think, just a really great example of kind of how the community worked together on that particular fact.
If you look at, of course, sometimes you do worry about, hey, new release is out, there may be regression, but there may be a lot of features that might get removed. Some still need them, or many don't. Is there anything like that users should be worried about, or there's no such thing? That is number one. Number two is that, of course, the upgrades are smooth, but are there any caveats that people should be aware of?
Well, all right. First of all, this was the 4.0 was the first time that we deprecated, or we got rid of Thrift, and that's a big change. And Thrift was an older protocol. We've switched to CQL protocol, which is a binary protocol for the drivers in Cassandra. But Thrift was one that was from the first. That was the fossil that was involved, is buried in the strata of Cassandra. Still, I call it a fossil, but there's still a lot of people I think that still think it's the right choice, but we decided as a project to move on from it. So on the upgrades, that was actually one of the most important things we tested. And we really wanted to make it simple and seamless, because if you had been upgrading Cassandra before, say, like in the 3 and 2s, there was always a long list of intermediate patches that you had to put into place, or, you had to do some extra work in mid upgrade. It just made it really complicated. So there was a really important call to make it simple. And that simple was, whenever you're running a version 3 Cassandra, it's just drop in the binaries and upgrade in place. It just should be that simple. And everything we've seen is like that. And that will give everyone a lot of confidence if they're upgrading right now. We want people to upgrade, because this is probably more stable than anything else that they're running right now.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I'd also add to that is, the added benefit of the fact that, we've been running this in production. A lot of the contributors they've had to travel that upgrade path already, right? So, that is one of the reasons why the upgrade path is going to be far more enjoyable than it used to be, is because, again, we've done that in production. We've run through that upgrade path, right? So again, for those that have, kind of done this process with Cassandra, I definitely invite them, to not stress too much about this one. Still run through all the checks and, the standard processes you do. But again, this has been pretty well battle tested.
Of course, the release is out and you folks are already working on the next releases. This is an open source project, so people can keep an eye on what's going on. But if I ask you, also one more thing is, when you're talking about people who are already using it, how many branches are there for Cassandra? Is it just one branch you start working on the next release, or there are two separate branches? One is stable one, which is supported, and then there is a test branch where people start dumping the code and start working on the next release. Can you talk about how do you work on these releases?
Well, that's actually changing quite a bit with 4.0. Since we started, we've had a lot of discussion inside the project about how we do upgrades and manage that sort of thing. So, of course, trunk is that's the current version of Cassandra. We're going to do minor releases within 6 months and major releases hopefully within a year. But the big changes, and this is a change in the way we do business in the project, is those big changes, like feature changes, are now around this Cassandra enhancement process. So instead of just having someone drop code into create a fork and drop some code in there and ask everyone what they think, we have a proposal process. And so you outline the change that you want to make. We have good discussions about it, make some changes before there's actual code. It's voted in. And then once that change is voted in, then all the code and the issues start getting created. So it gives a lot more structure about how we make major changes. And that's actually has a lot to do with just how you keep a project stable over time. Ben, did I miss anything? I think there's a lot more.
No, I think that's spot on. And, I think this is a maturity release. And we're not only seeing that in the code base and the testing and the documentation, but we're seeing that in the community process, right? And I think communication and shared understanding is so important to building consensus within a community. And the CEP process is a really awesome process that allows us to do that in a way that gives everyone a voice and an input, as we kind of go through some of these major changes, right? So again, I think another huge tick in the maturity box from a project and from a software perspective.
Right. You talk about community a lot. Can you talk a bit about what kind of community is there around Cassandra? How much of it is corporate developers versus, I don't know what kind of developers will work on free time on databases like kernel and other stuff. But if you can just give us a glimpse of what kind of community we are talking about.
All right. So I think the Apache Cassandra community is definitely, it's one that's very corporate, right? I think by nature, when it comes to databases, they get deployed in businesses. Businesses have a lot of data. They have those requirements, particularly true of Cassandra, where it tends to be used at the highest end of scale, right? So you do see a lot of corporate development. There's definitely a few commercializing players within the space. Both, me and Patrick come from, that particular breed. But you also see a lot of the big operators as well, right? People who run this at very large fleet sizes. But you also see kind of a great osmosis that goes through it, right? As people kind of cycle in and out of those organizations, you see them tend to stick within the community. Some come and go, but also a lot of people stick with the community, and they'll go and bring that, they'll work on it. But they might now be at a small startup somewhere, right? Or they might, be running in a consultancy, or they might be doing something different. But I think by and large, it is a very, corporate community, but it is a very, diverse one, and then the types of, companies and who works on it. It is a pretty great space to work. And I think, we've shown pretty effectively that we can all pull together in the right direction.
I think that there's a good way to classify our communities. We have our user community, which are the people who use Cassandra, and then there's the project community, and they blend plenty. But what's interesting for me is just how very concentrated and like you said, the people, if you go look at the LinkedIn of any of the committers on the Cassandra project, it's a good laugh, because they're you see them working all over the place, but they're always working on Cassandra. And it's a passion project for them. And that's great. But the user community, the people who actually use it every day, program against it, and write data model, do their data modeling, and that's just a really amazing and vibrant community as well, because these are people solving scale problems every day. So Cassandra is a part of their stack. So and I look at that community, especially now, cloud native applications really require the kind of database Cassandra is, and that community is growing there too. So I think of all of these communities and how they work together, and it's just a great day for both, because now Cassandra 4 is out. We can start talking more about what are you going to build with it. You have a stable database. Now what?
Right. And since, you kind of create a very good segue. It's out. So what is next? What kind of roadmap you have for the future releases? Of course, you share, that there will be minor releases, and then you'll aim for a major release every year. But if I ask, hey, so what is going to be the focus on the next release? Or this is still a problem that you want to tackle, what would that be?
I tell you what, I think I'm still catching my breath from the 4.0 release, to be brutally honest. There are a bunch of changes, performance improvements, further work on a lot of the things that made it into 4.0 that from a timing perspective, or they just weren't ready, will end up kind of getting moved into, 4.1 or, the next kind of couple of releases. I think we're going to see some great improvements when it comes to, for example, the observability side of things. 4.0, we landed a bunch of changes to support what are called virtual tables, right? So the ability to essentially get information about how Cassandra is performing using CQL itself, using the standard query language. For folk that are familiar with MySQL or Postgres, they're pretty used to that way of working, but that virtual table capability has landed in Cassandra, and we're just going to see that being built upon, right, and improving, right, and the kind of use cases or patterns that it will enable will kind of further improve. We'll also start to see better support for, say, some of the newer JVMs in some of the subsequent releases, right, I know that folk have done some testing with like, what is it, JVM 16 and seen some amazing performance improvements on that with some of the newer GC collectors. And I think, getting those to be officially supported in those later releases will be really great. Patrick, I'm sure there's like 20 million other things I've just missed, but they were the two things that came to my mind, to be honest.
Well, I'll tell you the truth, that's the CEPs are what I watch right now because I get excited about the future. So if you want the best roadmap, the CEPs are where it's at. And some of the ones that are really hot right now, and I think this actually points to a directionality, as we're getting more deployments in Kubernetes and getting closer to Kubernetes. Like one that's happening right now is creating hot swappable SSL certificates. And then there's some new indexing schemes have been proposed and it makes the data model much easier to use. Big changes in the way we store data, putting more variety in the way that we store data. So, these are some of the exciting things that are going to be the hallmark of a mature database as we start building out the breadth. One of the things that I'm also really excited about is the ecosystem. Seeing like how a stable database works in an ecosystem, like what projects are, I know that like the Liquidbase folks are really excited about 4.0 and I'm happy to like that they want to participate with their stuff. They have their own projects. So seeing how these projects now are starting to interact with Cassandra and building out that ecosystem, that's a sign of a healthy community. Thank you to everybody that has helped out with this release. I mean, and this was a team sport. It wasn't just a small handful of people. There are over 200 people that contributed to this release. Users that have tested, people that have contributed through forums and Stack Overflow. Just thank you. This is your release too.
Yeah. And you know what? There is still a chance to help out now. And you can help out by downloading it, putting it into production and letting us know how it goes, right? There is still 100% a chance to get involved in the 4.0 release. Yes, it's the most stable, release that we've had, but you know what? I'm also excited for that next patch release. So please get stuck into it. Go to cassandra.apache.org and download and give it a go.
Ben, Patrick, thank you so much for taking time out today and talk about an exciting discussion about a boring database. So thank you for that. And I look forward to our next discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers.